Thank you, Jeff. Go Bagpies. Embarrass myself and people will walk out, I know, but we all have our prejudices. This is my second time in Australia. I was here last fall at a biotech convention to discuss many of the same issues, but what I'm really focusing on today is the issue of how your industry, farmers, and the companies that service them interact with the public. You see the title that I put up there, GMOs and Precision Farming. Now you have a very clear definition for what precision farming means, but it also means something else in the biotechnology and genetic field. It means the way to change the genetics of various crops to gain certain kinds of traits, whether it be insect resistance, or a way to inoculate against viruses or bacteria, or to increase certain elements of it like nutrients. And there is a great debate over this in public about whether this is appropriate to so-called manipulate the genome, and we'll be discussing that today. The title, In Defense of Big Ag and Disruptive Technologies. Just so you understand it, Big Ag doesn't mean the big seed companies necessarily or the chemical companies. It really means mainstream agriculture, because as I'm going to discuss today, mainstream agriculture is under assault. I know that you have great belief in what you're doing. You feel a great sense of commitment to feeding Australia and feeding the world. But that's not the way the society has begun seeing these things. The agricultural industry, at least as it's perceived in the United States, and I would assume that if they're not parallels here now, they will become parallels over time, is that the agriculture industry has become self-focused, is disconnected from the needs of a lot of people because they're interested in things like high nutrition, safety, and they sometimes believe that so-called big ag doesn't address that. I believe that they're absolutely wrong, and we are going to be discussing that today. But before I start, I want to actually be a news ticker. As a longtime journalist, just a few hours ago, a deal was reached in the Senate of the United States, which will have, I believe, some implications around the world. It is a preliminary agreement and a bill, Democrats and Republicans supporting it, to preempt a labeling regimen in the United States. In other words, Vermont has passed a very tiny state, our second smallest state by population, has passed a mandatory GMO labeling regimen, which many companies have already begun introducing voluntary labels to comply with it. And there was great concern because there was a lot of differences of opinion about what kinds of things should be labeled. And as I will be discussing, there's a new generation of genetic engineering called gene editing, which will affect every one of you, and I'll be discussing that as we go forward. And there's a question of how this will be regulated. And what the deal, which would preempt the Vermont deal, if it's passed by the Senate. It would easily be passed by the House. The Senate is a bit of a wild card, but it was a joint measure between some leading Republicans and Democrats, and it would do three things. One, and again, you have your own regimen for labeling, but our labels would now be all barcodes, which I think is the wave of the future. We'll not be putting anything on packages. And I think this will open the door to a much more information going to consumers. Anti-GMO groups hate this because they want labels that look like skull and crossbones, that they could demonize and create a sense of fear. And that's driven the sales of the natural products and organic industry for about 10 or 15 years. Interestingly enough, the organic industry, the mainstream organic industry in the United States has bought into this bill, the Organic Trade Association. Why? Because now, without going through a special certification program, all products will be able to be labeled non-GMO. And there's no question that there are consumers who believe they want that choice. I don't believe it's science-based. I believe it's cultural and emotive, as we'll be talking about. Nonetheless, it's a way to be responsive to them without essentially marginalizing the science. So anything that is organic automatically will be able to have a certified USDA non-GMO label. And most importantly, I think, again, if this is passed, is that all gene-edited crops, not transgenic crops, GMOs is a word used to describe transgenic crops. When you take a gene from one organism and you put it in another, the transgene, gene editing is a revolution that we're essentially 3 years old. It's it's unfolding in the human area. Just 4 days ago, the first gene-edited human test in trying to eradicate cancer from a human was approved, a human trial. But it's also used in crops, again, adding a range of traits. And gene editing will not be labeled, because there is no trans genes in it. There's no called foreign genes, which really lowers dramatically the barrier for innovation. Australia is going through a reflection on this at the food standards level to try to decide how they are going to regulate gene editing. Gene editing is much less expensive. The average GMO crop takes 13 years, as much as $175 to $200 million to get approved. We just had a gene-edited apple approved, Arctic apple. You may have heard about it because CSIRO from Australia is the one who innovated the technology for it, licensed it to a Canadian company called Arctic Apple, and that product was introduced. It tweaks a gene so the apple does not brown as quickly. It does not brown, which is an enzymatic reaction, has nothing to do about the safety or health of an apple. That sailed through the US regulatory system. The Australian New Zealand board has already ruled that they do not believe that should be regulated as a GMO. And I think that the precedent set, if this bill is passed, and it's optimistic that it will be, it could have implications in Australia. I want to deal with what I think is the myth that the media is biased in favor of big ag. I am a member of the media. I was a television producer for 20 years. If you're familiar with Tom Brokaw, he's a well-known US anchor, and I was his producer for many years. And then I switched into writing about 20 years ago, have 7 books, and 2 that are pretty well known on agriculture. One on crop chemophobia, which talks about crop protection, and what are the real dangers or hazards of chemicals, and another on GMOs called Let Them Eat Precaution, if you're aware of the concerns voiced by anti-GMO activists that we shouldn't introduce GMO crops because we want to be precautious about potential dangers. And unfortunately, precaution won't feed the people of Africa, and our food needs will almost double in the next 30 to 40 years. But there's a real cultural bias, I believe, against modern agriculture, and it's increasing. I'll show you some statistics that suggest that that's true. I know you feel quite good about what you're doing, and you should. But there's a real cultural divide going on right now, and it's reflected in the markets, the rise in organics, and the questions being raised about the use of pest management and herbicides in the agricultural sector, and the overall use of technology in food and agriculture. The major critique is modern agriculture. Again, you could be a small vegetable farmer, a medium-sized vegetable farmer, but you'll be called an industrial agricultural farmer. That is the term used to label you. Terms matter. 15 years ago, in the early 90s, the term GMO didn't exist, genetically modified organism. That is a term, I use it now. Unfortunately, it's very unscientific. We're really talking about genetic engineering when we're talking about using moving genes, and we've had genetic modification for 10,000 years. Any of you who are broccoli farmers or Brussels sprouts farmers or any in that family knows that the origin of that was a mustard weed, inedible, but we've been able to modify things over 10,000 years, and then we began to be able to genetically engineer them in the past 50 years in various ways. But this is a highly controversial area, and there's an attempt to label anybody who is involved in either growing genetically engineered crops or developing them as part of a corporate structure, an industrial agricultural complex, and it's a real cultural divide that's developed in the United States and Europe, and I can only assume that there are echoes of it here in Australia, which I would assume would increase. You just go on the internet, and you see the kind of images that are used to throw a cloud over technology in general. What's so interesting about this, it is, again, a cultural movement. It's not directed specifically at agriculture. You have to understand that. The same people who are concerned with food and genetics are also concerned with things like very popular in the United States, which is fracking, which is a low-cost way to extract shale gas. It's come under attack as a disruptive technology, and it's been opposed by many of the same people that oppose biotechnology. Chemicals, all chemicals are considered particularly dangerous. Part of that is an artifact of the fact that over the past 15 years, we've developed ways to bioanalyze the amount of chemical residues in blood and urine, so we can now show elements of a trillionth or more, which you can then have headlines that say, glyphosate found in urine, glyphosate found in beer, glyphosate found in wine, or a range of other chemicals as well, whether it's atrazine or other things. They're at levels that every scientist in Australia, around the world, of note, would say is far below. We're not talking about just barely below, on the level of 10,000 times or more below potentially harmful levels to humans, but the fact it still can make it into a headline. And when you're a parent making food choices, the idea that your food might have chemical residues can be very, very scary. And again, the divide on this, it's not just science-educated people, it's not just people who are farmers who understand these issues, it's much of a cultural divide. What we found is some highly educated people, particularly people who would be called politically liberal, and I count myself in that group, but I actually part ways on many of these issues. They're actually clever at finding out arguments that justify their prejudices. So it's not an issue of IQ or intelligence or how well informed they are. There's a tribal identity that comes with various points of view. We also have a dramatic change that's happened since the 1990s, which is the growth of social media. And social media now sets the tone on how we perceive things, and because it's so quick out of the box when something develops, when there's a new twist in something, it's often reported in social media and then reflected in mainstream media. I say all the time when I'm at my doctor and I have I came with some kind of symptom, and I start describing all the problems that I read on the internet of that health problem, and he says, Dr. Google. And I think we tend to equate many of the things that we see on the internet. I was with a cab driver here the other day going to the mall, and the cab driver, his wife is Japanese, and says she's read about GMOs, and she knows that they're not safe because she's read articles about it. Well, what articles is she reading? There are 270 agencies around the world have issued declaratory statements about the safety of GMOs. Not one has issued one that's negative. They've all been positive. So she's obviously not reading Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. She's not reading the World Health Organization or the European Food Safety Authority or the National Academies of Sciences. She's reading WeHateGMOs.org and equating that with those kinds of things. But unfortunately, that's the way people think. So there's this feedback loop that exists between social media, the mainstream media, and the NGOs who have a special interest in promoting things. And promoting points of view that are highly skeptical of technology, because most of them are drawn from this anti-technology cultural mindset. Unfortunately, they've aligned themselves with the many elements in the organic industry. Now, let me be very, very clear here. I run a website, I'll tell you a little bit about it, called the Genetic Literacy Project. Many people in Australia read it, and we cover Australian biotech and genetic-related news. We have organic farmers writing for us. They're interested in the science, and they're interested in cooperation and coexistence with the mainstream conventional community. So I'm not here in any way throwing aspersions on the organic community. Let me make that clear. But the organic community the organic sales have been driven over the past 15 years on the backs of the demonization of what you do, of what a lot of you who are not organic farmers do. The scare tactics that have come, the fear of pesticides, the fear of chemicals, people actually willing to pay 75% to 200% more for products that offer no health or nutritional benefits. And from a sustainability point of view, which has become my focus, they're actually less beneficial sustainably than conventional agriculture. I know that may seem strange because you're used to being defensive, because chemicals are used as part of the regimen. Chemicals are used in the organic industry, natural chemicals, which sometimes copper sulfate, a number of others are actually more harmful and potentially carcinogenic, but they're definitely used less than the mainstream conventional agricultural industry. But there's a lot of misconceptions about the sustainability differences between the two, and I'm going to be addressing them today. As I mentioned, I run this nonprofit called the Genetic Literacy Project. It's now almost 6 years old. It takes no industry funding. You can go on the internet, and I am labeled as a Monsanto shill and you know, a dupe for Syngenta. I don't know why their checks are not coming regularly anymore. It's just very disappointing. All our funding is disclosed on our website. They're all organizations like the Searle Foundation and a major fund, a money fund called Templeton is one of our funders because they're very interested in science. No industry at all. I just happen to be an idealistic journalist that really cares about these issues, and that's what has motivated me. We focus not just on agricultural genetics, crop genetics, but we also focus on the organic conventional tensions that exist, and we focus on human genetics. Why? Because a lot of the misconceptions and the concerns about human genetics are echoed in the agricultural crop community. Again, we're going to be reflecting a little bit on gene editing, which is literally CRISPR editing has just 3, 4, 5 years in existence. It's a very low-cost way to make dramatic trait changes in crops. It's going to be very impactful in the horticultural industry over the next 4 to 5 years, and increasingly so in the decades ahead. Some of the pest management problems that you saw raised here will be able to be addressed in a very I think quick way, and it's almost an amazing technology, but it's the same technology that it's used in eradicating diseases. Right now there's a big controversy, probably you've heard about the Zika issue, threatening Brazil and also threatening the southern part of the United States. A company in Britain has developed a genetically modified mosquito that if it was released into the community would automatically lead to the sterilization of the mosquito that is causing the Zika virus. It could wipe out the Zika virus in a matter of months and literally eradicate that kind of pest forever, and it's a very interesting technology. Fear over gene editing is what's stopping it from being introduced. The same fear that the agricultural community will have to overcome. But there are steps being made to today's consensus agreement by the Senate committee. I think hopefully will be a step in that direction. And as I said, Australia Food Safety Centers has made some preliminary decisions indicating that they're going to be quite open about regulating, or said the other way, they're not going to be regulating some of these gene editing changes as GMOs. I want to talk about this cultural issue because I think it's important I'm really going to be appealing to you to be spokespeople for your industry and for genetics, actually. Again, it's not part of the Australian agricultural scene very much, only a couple of products. That will change with gene editing, even if traditional GMO products are not improved. Lojas is an acronym called Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability. It's a market segment focused on health and fitness, the environment, personal development, sustainable living, and social justice. It's estimated at over $300 billion worldwide. It's a cohort, people who say they're anti-vaccine, people who buy natural products on the web, people who buy supplements and vitamins. Obviously, there are people from every segment of the population who do all of those things, but they tend to congregate and share a certain kind of cultural values. They make up a tribe, so to speak, a cultural tribe. Organic has become a public way of showing their commitment to this tribe. Organic produce, no pesticides, herbicides, or bad vibes. Again, it is a cultural issue as well. We do research on this. I work with a German company called Sigwatch that analyzes NGO activity, and NGOs have focus, and many of the NGOs that I cover are very much part of the Lojas community and are very active in it. I looked in the food segment of food activism, and you could see that Biotech, is this point not particularly well. Anyway, biotech regulation and labeling remains the major issue in the food industry. Again, you have very few products, so you don't feel it as much, but this will be heating up. On the gene editing area, I saw Friends of the Earth Australia just issued a statement a couple of weeks ago, very, very critical of gene editing because they're afraid that food standards will not regulate it as GMOs because food standards have already issued a statement saying they would not. And it's going to, Greenpeace Australia has come out against it, and you're going to see a number of other of the anti-biotech cohorts very much against it. And you can see that pesticides and very much the issue of neonicotinoids, which is an issue in the United States and Europe, and a little bit less so, but obviously you use neonics as well here. But you can see these are very, very heated issues and dominate some of the debate over food. The biotech issues were very, very dominant in the late 1990s when you were debating whether crops would be introduced in Australia. It was the same thing was going on in Europe. The United States and I think Brazil had introduced crops in 1996. There was less controversy, but they kind of slipped under the regulatory door, and therefore there was less controversy, but it was quite heated. But that was the largest period of interest and focus was the late 1990s. Then you see a blip up around 2009, 2010, and that's over the neonic issue. That's the bee apocalypse that you might have heard something talked about. Actually, I've written a number of articles in this for major magazines. There is no bee apocalypse right now. The beehives, well, Australia is particularly has had a fairly sizable rise in beehive numbers over the past decade and a half since neonics were introduced into the 1990s. But worldwide, beehive numbers are up. There's no question there's some health-related issues. Most of the studies that have come out in recent years link it to the varroa mite and other kinds of pests that are challenging it, but it has become a symbol by just selecting out neonics, caricaturing a problem, creating an enemy, creating a high-profile symbol, neonics, bees, big corporations, Syngenta, Bayer, and so forth. It's an easy target, and it's a way to throw aspersions on the modern agricultural industry. Again, one of the attributes of the cultural grouping that we're talking about, the Lojas group, is a suspicion of large organizations, be it government or be it corporations. And you can see a steady decline from the early 2000s. That I would say the early 2000s is really the birth of the food movement. We always should be wary about saying correlation is causation. It's not. For instance, there's been a increase in the rate of autism over the past 15 years, which actually correlates quite well with the increase of organic food sales worldwide. I don't think organic food sales are driving autism, so I'd be wary of making the same kind of correlation analysis here. But we do see a change in the respect for federal government and respect for major corporations, which has implications for you because corporations supply you with your seeds and they supply you with your crop protection materials. The various companies have been sorted out, mostly the crop protection companies and the seed companies, as the signal focus. It's the Monsantoization of the debate. Monsanto is by far considered one of the ugliest, most awful, most terrible companies in the world by the NGOs. I think second only to Shell in terms of negative ratings among major corporations, despite the fact my personal view of them is they're one of the most progressive companies in the ag field. I see them as a leader in the way that I see Apple as a leader, let's say, in computer communications. But a lot of the major companies, Dow Chemicals, Syngenta, DuPont, and so forth, Cargill, they're all either seed or chemical companies, and they are taking the flak and becoming the symbol of what you do, even though you might have a small or medium-sized farms. So the antis are really my concern, and my concern is that they've melded with the organic movement. And again, I don't want to demonize individual organic farmers, or even some in the United States. We have two major organic trade groups. One is the Organic Trade Association, which generally plays it fairly straight and narrow. They're an organic trade group, promotes the interest of the group, doesn't I think steps over the line occasionally, but is pretty, I think, fair and honest in the way they promote themselves. But then we have something called the Organic Consumers Association, which, among other things, believes that we can cure AIDS by taking supplements. They're against vaccines, and of course, they're anti-GMO, and they believe that the organic lifestyle, the Lojas lifestyle, is the way to go, and they have a lot of support, and they are leading and funding attacks on people like me and scientists, biotechnology scientists in the United States. I'm going to show you now a video that's very popular that was made by the head of an organization called Just Label It, which has been the point organization trying to get mandatory labeling in the United States. But the person who is also head of one of the largest organic manufacturers in the United States. His name is Gary Hirschberg. They're in the dairy sector, and they produce milk and cheeses and yogurts and things of that kind. And he's become a leader, I think, in demonizing modern ag. I hope you won't be too shocked by this, but let's show it and then we'll talk about it.
Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, and on that farm he had some cows, E-I-E-I-O, with a hormone here and a hormone there, here a moan, there a moan, everywhere a hormone. Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, and on that farm he sprayed some crops, E-I-E-I-O, with some GMOs here and a pesticide there. Here a spray, there a spray, everywhere a spray, spray. A small cage here and a tight cage there. Here a moan, there a moan, everywhere a spray, spray. Old MacDonald had a New MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm the animals roamed. E-I-E-I-O. With a pasture here and some open space there. Here they roam, there they roam, never any hormones. New MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O. And that farm was chemical free, with no GMOs, with healthy soil here and organic crops there. Toxic pesticides can say goodbye. No more toxins in our lives. New MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O.
The target is precision farming. The target is mainstream agriculture. The target is you. This is a picture that I found on the internet. When I say farmer, which image comes to mind? Farmer Joe there on the left, or someone in a hazmat suit? I want to give you a sense of the irony of that. About 3 weeks ago, a California community, a California county, on the verge of banning glyphosate over fears that glyphosate is carcinogenic, which it's not. They took peremptory action to phase out glyphosate and introduce organic spraying. When they were using glyphosate, it was just sprayed with no protective gear, because it was not, all of you know how watered down it is and how relatively mild it is from a carcinogenic point of view. It has the carcinogenicity of salt, table salt. It's not particularly hazardous at all. The organic sprays, the soap sprays that they used was so potentially dangerous, they had to wear hazmat suits, they had to wear respirators, and the cost was 11 times what it was to use glyphosate, and the community was applauding this as a rational decision, and it's the wealthiest community in California, the wealthiest county in California. So this is not a matter of education, this is a matter of irrationality and cold identification. And again, I don't want to scare you, but the target is mainstream and modern agriculture. A lot of the fears over the past few years have been focused on the issue of GMO safety. Many of you who follow this debate have probably seen pictures that on the bottom left there are of rats grotesquely distorted, supposedly by eating GMOs or by having glyphosate residue in the food pellets that they were eating. The perpetrator, or rather, that slipped out, the scientist who published the study, Gilles-Eric Seralini from France, the paper was essentially rescinded. And it wasn't rescinded, it was essentially rejected. Not rejected, it was rescinded by the publishing paper 9 months after it was printed. The so-called rats that you see there, it turns out that the rats that were used in the study are a kind called Sprague-Dawley rats, which are used in chemical analysis all the time, which are cancer-prone. What he didn't show, yes, those GMO-fed rats had that distortions, but so did the non-GMO rats. All the rats were distorted by that. The paper was essentially was retracted. He couldn't get it republished in a mainstream journal, so he went to what's called a pay-for-play journal, a journal where you can actually buy your way into the journal, and he bought his way into a new journal that was not peer-reviewed, and today you can still find references in debates in Congress, in the United States, it comes up in Australia all the time, in debates where people cite the Seralini study, the one that was retracted, but no, it was republished in a pay-for-play journal. But that, thankfully, over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a real sea change, at least in the United States. I don't know how much here, but I was heartened by the Organic Supreme Court, Western Australia Supreme Court case that we covered. The safety issue has been addressed. Most recently in the United States, 2 months ago, the U.S. National Academies of Science issued its 11th statement on the safety of GMOs, concluding that genetically engineered crops have not caused increases in cancer, obesity, gastrointestinal illnesses, kidney disease, autism, allergies, and there are, quote, no differences that would implicate a higher risk to human health from eating GE foods than from eating their non-GE counterparts. Every major science agency in the world has endorsed that view. The problem is many activist groups are no longer targeting GMOs directly. What they are doing is that they are going after proxies for GMOs, glyphosate and neonicotinoids. So you see Stop Monsanto's Monarch Massacre, which is supposedly because glyphosate is so effective as a weed killer, it kills the weeds that actually the monarch butterfly in the United States and Mexico actually feed upon. But there's been new studies, many of them which don't implicate Roundup for that. Nonetheless, that's become a rallying cry, along with neonicotinoids, and of course the focus on Roundup. I showed you that chart previously that was kind of straight for biotech activism. Look at this chart, though. This is the chart of pesticide how NGOs are going after pesticides, and it's now exceeding the activity against biotechs. So that means you are in the crosshairs. It doesn't matter if you embrace GMOs or not. You will be seen as part and proxy of big ag, a part and attached to the intensive agricultural system. The jumps there, the one in 2009 is over bees, and the one in 2005 is over this, a study was released by a WHO agency, World Health Organization agency, which raised hazard concerns about glyphosate, and they put glyphosate in the same category, get this, as sunlight, processed meat, and coffee. So it's a real hazard. That's the category it was in, but NGO activists have obviously made a lot of hay, and glyphosate is up for renewal in Europe right now. There's a June 30th deadline, and France and Germany, particularly France, has been aggressive in trying to get glyphosate not renewed, and if it's not renewed, then it's going to be pulled from farmers' use. And believe me, if that happens, there's going to be targets to remove glyphosate use around the world. So essentially, we have a cultural split, organics driving it, with the organically grown showing beautiful images of safe and happy people and hazmat suits for genetically modified foods. We see NGOs, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere, using legal means. This is this person, Andrew Kimbrell, is head of an agency called the Center for Food Safety, which files legal briefs to try to muck up the works. They don't necessarily believe that they will stop legislation, but what they want to do is create enough legal chaos that they can delay the implementation of progressive legislation that would allow regulation to proceed in a reasonable manner rather than a crazy manner. But look, that they're focusing on genetic engineering as a process. Anything involving genetic engineering is their target. The United States, the agreement today suggests that we want to look at the individual products of genetic engineering. What specific trait is changed in a particular product, and is that product in and of itself safe, rather than regulating the process. In Australia, you have process regulation. In Europe, you have process regulation. That's one of the key reasons why there's been so many restrictions on genetically modified foods. Anti-GMOs annual budgets will exceed US $10 billion in 2015, or did. They use all kinds of images. That's Stonyfield Farms, again, trying to demonize conventional agriculture. Global market for certified organic products exceeds US $100 billion in 2015, and the global GMO seed market is only $35 billion. Monsanto does not control the world. It represents 5% of the world food supply. One of the main sustainability issues, I'll briefly touch on that and then wrap up. These are grain crops. These are organic yield gaps for row crops. You could see that there's a huge yield gap between regular conventionally grown crops. These are not GMO, these are just conventional crops. Compared with organic crops, it's as much as a 45% gap in cotton. There's a couple of cover crops, rye and hay, not alfalfa, in which organics does so an advantage. The same holds true in the fruit area. I think the smallest yield gap is apples, about 12%. Oranges is the highest yield gap in organic versus conventional, about 57%. That's a sustainability issue. We're going to have to cut down forests for arable land if we want to feed Australia and feed the world. We can't do it with a landmass that exists. The only way we can do it is to cut down forests. If we switch to an agroecological organic system, we're going to increase global warming. We're going to cut down carbon-sucking forests, and it's going to create one of the key factors in creating a sustainability disaster. So yield matters, and yield matters not just from a productivity point of view, it matters from a sustainability point of view. And that's, I think, some of the messages that are not particularly stressed. A major study that came out just last year looked at all GMO products versus non-GMOs, and pesticide use was down 37%. You know, you have insect-resistant GMOs in the cotton area, in the soybean area, in BT brinjal, which is used in Bangladesh and others, and you have cut down spraying as much as 95%. Yields are up 22% using GMOs, and profits are up 20% as well. And the key thing, no-till, which I think you're moving towards lower and no-till practices as much as possible. It's much more possible with GMOs because of the use of herbicide-resistant crops, and that's obviously helps in not releasing greenhouse gases. So the communications challenges that you face, what are they? Skepticism of government, we talked about that. Anti-corporatism, anti-technology, a general belief that precision agriculture, the kind that you use and the kind that I'm talking about in genetics, is something to be feared rather than to be embraced. Scientifically illiterate media, I hate to say that, but the media tends to believe in what we call false balance. There was a survey recently of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, asking two questions, one about global warming, and 87% of the scientists believe that global warming was caused in part by human intervention, and 88%, a higher percentage, believed that GMOs are safe. 37% of the population believes that versus 88% of scientists. Journalists, though, believe in false balance. You'll hear a piece on GMOs and you'll hear one person saying it's safe and another person saying it's not, but the person that's not represents 12% of the science population. That's called false balance, and that's what we face all the time in covering these issues. The social media echo chamber, polarized political environment. There's very little overlap, though interestingly, the anti-GMO movement, anti-vaccine, anti-technology movement brings together the skeptical government right wing and the skeptical skeptical corporations left wing. A romanticized foodie culture, which has been in place for 15 years, that believes that everything organic is safer and healthier, and a disconnect with farming and farmers. It's essentially you. If you do not tell your story, someone else will create it for you. So I really urge you to think about framing the stories that you know that are true, the sustainability benefits that you offer, the yield benefits, the productivity benefits, their concerns for world food and hunger issues, and communicate them more directly, not only in organizations like this, but actively go out and try to tell your message through the media and elsewhere, because ultimately, if you do not tell your story, someone's going to tell it for you, and it's not going to go well. Thank you very much.